Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of Bournemouth Christchurch and Poole Council Audit and Governance Committee. A very warm welcome to members of the committee, to members of the public, and to the officers and others who will be taking part in our meeting this evening. I will start by handing over to Mr. Hampton from Democratic Services, who will take us through the procedure for the meeting. Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, everyone. Please note that this meeting of the Audit Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. Anyone who is on the call but not in the room and wishing to speak, please use the raise your hand feature and switch on your video when invited to speak. Please could members in the room only speak when invited to by the Chairman and mute the microphones when not speaking. And finally, please also ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent during the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hampton. Could I now ask you to take us through items 1, 2 and 3 on the agenda, commencing with apologies?
Chairman, we've received apologies from Councillors Fear and Councillor Filer. We have 2 substitutes. Councillor Kelsey is substituting for Councillor Fear and Councillor Jude Sputt is substituting for Councillor Filer.
And a very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for substituting, it's appreciated. Mr. Hampton, item 3, declarations.
Thank you, Chairman. I invite any members with declarations to declare them now.
Councillor Cox.
I can assure you I have no keen interest in this.
Thank you very much. That takes us to item 4 on the agenda, which is confirmation of minutes. We'll be dealing with this in 2 parts. The first is the minutes of the 3rd of March, which we took through our last meeting last week, for which there is a correction. And I'm very grateful to Councillor Brooke for spotting said error and for correcting it. Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Chairman. Regarding the minutes of the 3rd of February, the statistical information reported to the committee on the 3rd of February about grants and awards made and is set out in minute 78 of the minutes approved by the committee last week, contained 2 items for a typographical correction, which have been highlighted by Councillor Brooke, and the relevant part of the minute should read as follows. 24 local restrictions support grant sector payments worth £17.7k. 41 local restrictions support grant closed payments worth £76.6k. Thank you, Chairman.
So members, can we accept those 2 corrections, please, and have the minutes amended accordingly? Are we all in agreement on that? Thank you very much indeed. So that then takes us to the minutes for our meeting last week on the 10th of March. Are you satisfied that they're a true and accurate record of that meeting? Thank you all very much. Item 5, public issues. Mr. Hampton.
Chairman, we have received 1 public question as follows. Question. Regarding Council's continuing website link failures impeding and denying access in the public domain to essential information, will this regulatory committee recommend that the Council's website be urgently reviewed for broken links preventing ready access to vital governance information and protocols? Examples: unacceptably long inaccessibility of information regarding members' allowances via the designated portal, which wrongly also required password logon, first notified by me in writing 5 months before eventual rectification 7/1/22. Likewise today, inoperative links on this meeting's agenda frontsheet and reports pack regarding item 5 public issues, particularly germane because those links provide explanation of the putative eligibility criteria for such issues contained in the Constitution, but which should not necessitate that level of research. Philip Gattrell, 10th of March 2022. And the response, Chairman: it is confirmed that broken web links will be identified as a matter of urgency and corrected as quickly as possible. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hanson. That now takes us on to item 6 on the agenda. Councillor Cox.
Sorry, can I just add that I do think we should thank him if he's found a mistake. I think the answer's a bit plain and a bit, and if he's identified an error, which he clearly has, and it's clearly important, then we should at least thank him when we respond. And just one other thing is, yes, I am the other person that's receiving his emails, not you know. And I am aware that. Sorry, I do have a very low voice. I am aware that he has asked other questions which have not been allowed. One of which I think is quite pertinent, and therefore I just wanted to. I think that should be recorded that he has asked other questions which has not been. We've decided not to, or you presumably as chair have decided not to take.
Well, I wasn't aware that you were being copied into his emails. For transparency, yes, he has been corresponding with me, which I think is probably fairly well known. In terms of the 2 points that you make, the first is I've got no hesitation in thanking Mr. Gattrell, and indeed, just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm happy that we can add that to what Mr. Hanson will describe in the minutes. In terms of any further questions, they're not a matter for this meeting this evening. I have written to him accordingly on the advice of the monitoring officer and welcomed him bringing them to us in the proper format in the appropriate future meeting, which will be a regular meeting of this committee. The reason that they're not eligible for this evening's meeting is simply because this meeting is an additional meeting for specific business, a little bit like last week's meeting was as well. If we just kept to the regular meetings, he would get them asked at every meeting that he puts them forward for. As you know, we are dealing with a lot more business than perhaps was originally intended, because we want to make sure that we've got a proper governance examination over a variety of different subjects that have come forward, usually from members or from myself. And I want to make sure that we don't actually confuse what those meetings are about with questions which are not directly relevant to the subject matter. So I have written back to the monitoring officer to confirm my position, because yes, you're right, the decision ultimately is that of the chairman, but she in turn has written accordingly back to Mr. Gattrell to confirm that those questions will be welcome at the next regular meeting. So members, that takes us on to item 6 on the agenda, which is external audit progress for 2020-21. As members will be aware, we have had this subject before us before. There have been delays in that process being concluded, as we heard at our last regular meeting, and we agreed that we would bring it back to future meetings of this committee so that we could keep a close eye on where we got to and whether there was any material move from the position that we'd had explained by Grant Thornton. So how I propose to deal with this important item is to ask Pete Barber from Grant Thornton to run through the current situation. I'll then go to the 151 officer, Adam Richins, for any comments that he might have. I have a small, a very small item to add to it at that stage if it hasn't already been covered, and then I'll go to questions from the committee, which will be fielded presumably mainly by Mr. Barber from Grant Thornton. And I hope that then we can understand better where we've got to and when and where we're likely to go after that. So, Mr. Barber, welcome to this evening's meeting. Perhaps you could give us an update.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. As the Chair outlined, this progress report sets out our position against the 2021 audit. And just to remind members, our role is twofold: an opinion on your financial statements and the issuing of the VFM conclusion. The current status of the opinion work is set out on page 14 of your papers. And as the Chair outlined at the previous meeting that we attended of this committee back in January, we reported that delays had been experienced in completing our opinion audit due to some challenges within the financial statements, predominantly around land and buildings, but also in relation to payroll procedures and reconciliations, and also the fact that we'd had to do some further work and increased sampling due to some IT segregation issues. Since January, good progress has been made in those areas and other areas, and we are a lot closer to concluding in those areas. There are still some queries with officers, but we are confident that they will be resolved with limited additional input. We will need at some stage a revised set of accounts, given the number of changes we've agreed with officers to check them, but we do not see that being a major driver in restricting our ability to complete our work. That said, there are two key areas that do remain outstanding, and those are detailed on page 14 of our report. The first one that no doubt members of this committee will be familiar with, because I've mentioned it on a number of occasions previously, is in relation to the letter of assurance that we seek from the auditors of Dorset Pension Fund. As of today, I have still not received that, and without that, I am not in a position to gain the assurance I need over the IAS 19 net liability position in relation to the pension fund disclosure. There are, if I really need to, alternative procedures that I could undertake, but they are very involved for both us and you, and that is why we do, as do other auditors within local government, seek to get assurances from the pension fund auditor to avoid that additional work. And until I've got that, I cannot conclude. And it is not just a case of receiving that letter from the auditors of Dorset Pension Fund. There are then some procedures that I need to do depending on what that report says. In addition to that point on the pension fund, there is a new issue, a national issue that has arisen in relation to infrastructure assets. Infrastructure assets in BCP are in your balance sheet at just under £300 million in terms of carrying value. I think it's £293 million. One of the firms that is responsible for public sector audit raised a concern about the assurances they've been able to obtain in relation to the carrying value of infrastructure at a national meeting of all audit firms before Christmas. Further dialogue has taken place, and there was another meeting of all firms responsible for external audit within local government, as well as the NAO, FRC and SITFA. And that meeting took place on Thursday last week, and there was a unilateral agreement that further work would be required and all firms would initiate that for all councils where the 2021 audit was outstanding and where infrastructure was material. And on the back of that, we have sent on Monday to officers a request for further information on the process that BCP uses for determining the carrying value of infrastructure. And that is the first stage in additional work that we will need to undertake that will unfortunately involve more input from both officers and ourselves to gain a better understanding of how you arrive at those figures, and in turn whether we are happy that those fairly reflect the true carrying value of those assets. So there is more work to do in relation to the opinion, and we will continue to work with officers in that regard. I am conscious that at the moment the Deputy Director of Finance paternity leave, and I'm also conscious that another key individual, the finance manager, is also off at the moment as well. So clearly we are dependent on being able to engage with them shortly to proceed these matters. So that is the position with the opinion. Just briefly, if I may, Chair, over onto page 15. In relation to the VFM conclusion, we have made good progress in that regard. There are a few small queries that we are awaiting a response on, but we will be commencing drafting our auditor's annual report in respect to the value for money conclusion shortly. Unsurprisingly, one of the areas that we will be referencing, and I'm hoping this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, is in relation to Ofsted and the inadequate children's services rating that was reported as a key weakness last year. Once again, that will be the case this year. But rather than issue that in isolation, we will wait till we've got the whole report covering all key areas. We will share that with officers first for factual accuracy, and then bring that to a meeting of this committee. And I suspect that we will be bringing that to this committee along the same timeline as that for the opinion. The only other area I wanted to mention was certification and claims. We do separately agree to undertake certification and claims across a number of areas at BCP, and that work for 2021 is now complete. So that is a brief run through of where we're at in relation to 2021. I'll stop there, Chair, but I'm happy to take any questions on the detail.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber. As I said, we'll come back to you for questions shortly. Before then, could I call on Mr. Richards, the Council's 151 officer? Have you any comments you'd like to make on the process and the position that we find ourselves in at the moment? Mr. Richards.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And yes, I would like to take the opportunity to raise a few points. The first point is, I suppose, frustration at the process. Frustration that the pension fund issue and the infrastructure issues which are matters generally outside of Council's control, are creating this further delay, and the concern with the reputational impact that then will be perceived in regards to the Council and its financial standing as a result of that delay. So that is of significant concern to me. I do know that both myself and you as Chair have put pressure on our Dorset Council colleagues. I've had a conversation directly with the Section 151 officer. I know you raised the matter at the recent Dorset Pension Fund Committee with regards to trying to support the external auditors for BCP in getting the necessary information with regards to the position on the Dorset Pension Fund, that we need in order to satisfy the requirements so that our accounts can be signed off. So, that is a concern, and that is a frustration, and that is something that I know both of us have tried to support Peter and his team in resolving, but at this moment in time we continue to make little headway. I'm also concerned about the additional infrastructure requirements, because clearly this is something that's developed quite late in the day in regards to the 21-22 accounts. Certain local authorities whose accounts would have been signed off by the auditors at that point will not have to address it, as I understand it, for 21-22, but because our accounts and a number of our local authorities' accounts weren't signed off, then it becomes an issue for us and will need to be resolved. And I'm concerned as to the potential to add to additional audit fee that we might be potentially exposed to, and clearly the impact on value for money with regards to our residents and the cost to those residents of the whole process. In addition to that, I suppose I am concerned about the impact that has on my team. My team generally go through, they prepare for the audit, they prepare all the papers, they then meet with external auditors, sign off, and then they have a break for other work, before they then go back to the audit process. We're going to be in a position now where we're starting the work on the 21-22 accounts at the same time as having an open 19-20 set of accounts to be resolved. So they're almost having to juggle two, and they haven't had that gap in between to do other work as part of that process. So concerned about the resource implications that it will have on my team. And further to that, I think there's that growing concern around actually the frailty of the whole audit process, because I think we've recently seen that there's been some potential emergency changes to the local accounting code of practice in regards to the 21-22 accounts that we'll have to follow, and therefore I think it's starting to really emphasise the weaknesses in the current process that we've got, and therefore interested to see how that plays out with regards to future direction of travel, because we know there has been those national reviews of the external audit process and arrangements. My final point is probably a personal one, to say, well, actually, Matt Filmer is here tonight, my Assistant Director of Finance. He is back from his paternity leave, and to congratulate him on the birth of his son.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Richardson. I'm sure we'd all like to join with you in congratulating Mr. Filmer. It's good to have him back. Just before I pass back to members for questions, I think perhaps, Mr. Barber, just one or two points to bring out to help inform those questions, that partly from what Mr. Richards has been saying, and in no particular order. So Mr. Richards is absolutely right. The issue around the Dorset County Pension Fund, whose external auditors are Deloitte's, and I think what you're awaiting is a letter of assurance from them, which they are unable to provide at this stage. I did raise this at the Dorset County Pension Fund meeting last Thursday, having first listened carefully to Dorset Council's 151 officer Aidan Dunn, and I did remind the meeting that there are implications for councils other than Dorset Council in this process, and I know that Aidan Dunn will be doing everything that he can to accelerate the process, provided he's able to do that. But I've also asked him to make sure that he keeps in very close touch with his counterparty, Mr. Richins, here in BCP Council, and indeed with me as the linked person through to that process that I raised last week. I don't believe there's much more that anybody can do about that, because we're not in control of the situation. But I do think that what members may want to hear about is whether you think you are able to look at a prospective time scale for this. Obviously, we keep it on our audit and governance forward plan. It's next marked up for the last meeting in this municipal year on the 14th of April. I suspect from what you've said that we're not going to meet that date, and it will no doubt get carried forward into the next forward plan. But what I think concerns me is that we're coming up very shortly to the anniversary of the year end and into another year, and so we'll be looking backwards at that stage to the audit not being complete for the then year before last. And it does occur to me that if there's this potential logjam with the NRC, the NAO, and with SIPFA, that other firms may take a view that they can't commence with those audits for 21-22, and that actually the whole system then grinds to a complete halt. We just happen to be a bit later than those that were taken through prior to that being the issue. That really does concern me, not just for us, but actually nationally and reputationally for local government. And I just wonder whether you could perhaps flesh out a little bit more detail around that process so that we all understand, whilst it might not be something that any of us can do anything about, but that we actually understand what the process may result in as those talks progress, we hope, but because they haven't progressed thus far, may bring the whole situation to a halt until they are. And maybe you can give us an idea of your expectation on that time scale, even though you may not be able to be totally specific about it. So if I could just ask you those to clarify those points, and then I'll go to questions from members.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. And just if I can, just to concur with the Director of Finance comments, I appreciate that if we went back 4 or 5 years, a typical finance officer in local government would be dealing with the auditors between probably May and July, and that would be very resource intense, but it would nonetheless enable them then to revert back to the day job of in-year monitoring and preparing for the budget for the following year. I think it's fair to say over the last 5 or 6 years, the increase in the time required on the part of the auditor and of officers in terms of the additional queries has been, the time has increased exponentially, and that has ramifications for us as an audit firm and other audit firms, but also for officers as well. So we feel that frustration in terms of completing the audit. If I take the areas that I've outlined, I think, you know, I cannot preempt what the Dorset Pension Fund auditors will report. Historically, there's not been significant issues identified, and assuming that is the case on receipt of that letter of assurance, it wouldn't be a significant amount of work on our part in it, assuming the letter is consistent with previous years, to conclude the work in that area. As I outlined in my introduction, the other areas that I've referred to that have caused us issues so far are close, and it's great to hear that the Deputy DOF is back, and that will no doubt assist significantly in the progress. The infrastructure, if I'm brutally honest, is a bit of an unknown. We are we've been provided with advice on approach, and I don't know where that will leave us. The DOF is absolutely right. Those audits that have been signed off for 2021 will have been signed off with similar levels of work undertaken on infrastructure assets. Those audits, including BCP, that remain open, will be subject to a much larger and higher degree of challenge from us, and will be need to provide more information than their peers who've had their accounts signed off. What I would say, and it's probably small, you know, it's not really relevant for the position at the moment, but next year, 21-22, when I say next year, audit is a retrospective exercise. So for 21-22, those that haven't had that challenge in 2021 because they've had their account signed off will absolutely face that same challenge, admittedly a year later. It is interesting because the Director of Finance did mention the emergency code that CITFA have proposed. I think an advice has come out this afternoon to say that CITFA have decided not to progress any of the proposed pausing around formal valuations of assets. That was discussed and it's been rejected this afternoon. So my clear understanding is that next year will be a normal year, if there is such thing as a normal year, and infrastructure will be within that for all councils, but nonetheless there will be more work required for yourselves. So we continue to work to resolve and conclude on 2021. Chair, you did ask about 21-22, and just to reassure you that we are very keen to work with you to try and catch up. You know, the deadline, the target sign off for 21-22 accounts has been set at the end of November. We are very keen to get 2021 done and also bring forward 21-22. We've already started the planning for 21-22, and I've been very clear with the team that there is no ethical reasons or any concerns within the council's arrangements for producing financial statements that would prevent me starting planning for 21-22. In fact, we had the internal engagement team meeting for BCP earlier this week, and we will be looking to progress planning in the next few months, and with the intention of bringing a plan probably around June or July time, and we will agree with officers a timeline that I would hope would bring forward the audit cycle, not probably to the end of November, but I think what we do need to be doing is stretching ourselves and challenging ourselves to catch up, because that's in everybody's benefit. I'll stop there, Chair, but take any questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. That's welcoming as far as it goes, actually, because it does mean that there is a plan which may mean that we can catch up in the next audit and subsequent audits as an instrumental part of that plan. The only issue that you haven't covered was the one raised by Mr. Richins with regard to the level of fee and the resources issues.
So there will be fee ramifications for the infrastructure work. Clearly, any work that we need to do will be billable, and once we get through this audit, it will be for me to outline that to the Director of Finance and explain that, and in turn, I will bring that information on the impact on the fee back to this committee. But rest assured, there is a control mechanism in place for those fees in the form of public sector audit appointments. So before we can bill any additional fee, we are required to submit details supporting any variance against the scale fee to public sector audit appointments, and they will then undertake a check on those additional fees to satisfy themselves that those are reasonable before those are signed off by public sector audit appointments. But clearly what I would want to do is make sure I clearly articulate to you and to officers the basis of those additional fees once they have been finalised.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. I'll now go to questions from members of the committee. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, clearly we're in a mess, and I just wanted to deal with the two issues separately, if I could. In terms of the pension scheme, has anybody actually asked Deloitte why they want, what is wrong, and why they won't issue that letter? I haven't heard anything tonight to say actually what's their problem, why won't they issue the letter? Because if it's fundamental, then actually that's important. If it's some technical issue, then that's another matter, and we should know about what the small technical matter is. And I do feel that somebody somewhere needs to write and complain to the Deloitte, and then demand that we recharge them for any extra costs that we're incurring as a result. I don't think that's terribly unreasonable. I suspect they're getting paid an awful lot of money for doing what they do. The other points in terms of the infrastructure, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Barber, what I wrote down here is that you were going to have to do a lot of work to go back and ask how this works, how the infrastructure works. And it struck me that why on earth don't you know already? You're the auditors. You have been the auditors for an awful long time, and you should already know that information. You should certainly not be going back and trying to figure out how that line works. So I was a bit, unless I'm completely misunderstood, then I'd quite like to have your answer to that. And in terms of the infrastructure, I'd like to know which local authorities have been signed off at the currently, and surely there should be some mechanism to, presumably they're wrong. You know, if they haven't had done the work, then their accounts are wrong, and somebody should point that out to the relevant bodies that they're wrong, because if we can't use it, then why have they been allowed to use it, and why have they carried on using it? That seems completely wrong to me. That that there needs to be some accountability. We can't have, just because of a matter of timing, we can't have a position where some councils got away with it because they were a bit quicker, and some councils are not getting away with it. So I'd quite like to know who's been signed off, and why isn't somebody pursuing them to have them redone? Because presumably they're wrong.
Mr. Barber, would you like to take those two significant points, please?
Yes. So just in terms of the the first point around the pension fund auditors. I have my last communication with the partner at Deloitte was the end of January, where I was informed that the work was very close, and it was just a case of partner review before they would be in a position to issue the letter in a few days. I've now got radio silence and I've not had a response since then. On the back of this call, I will chase again, but I've sent numerous emails to seek a clear view from them on timelines, and a response has not been forthcoming. So I don't think there is a lot more that I can do other than continuing to try to get a response and understand the position. I mean, it's a good challenge as to whether there's anything more fundamental that's causing the delay. I don't know. I just don't know. On the second point in relation to infrastructure, in terms of why haven't we done this already, I suppose my reflection on this would be that this is attuned to the development and the additional work that we've been doing in a number of areas over the last few years. So if we went back, 5 or 6 years and we looked at land and buildings and property and your BIC and stuff, we would rely on the valuer to value it. We would accept it, and we do some checks. But following challenge from our regulator, the FRC, who have said, well, actually, you need as auditors to be more sceptical. You need to challenge management and experts' judgments. You will know as well as I do that the amount of challenge that we've made of certain elements of your accounts in the last few years have been far greater than they ever were 7, 8, 9 years ago. And that's why the audit process takes so much longer and is so much more resource intense. If I look at the property, plant and equipment work that we've done on the file this year, it is poles apart from what was undertaken even a few years ago. It's far more in depth. And if I'm honest, how has that been driven? That's been driven by criticism from the regulator of all firms in terms of the level of detail they're going into. And I suppose my reflection on infrastructure is this is just another iteration in the process. The FRC have been critical across a number of reviews across a number of firms in relation to the level of challenge of the detail to support the infrastructure figures. Infrastructure, and I don't want to go into too much technical detail, but they're different from other assets in that they're large values, but they're held at depreciated historic cost. They would normally have asset lives and they're deferred on a straight line basis. New expenditure is capitalised, but then the accounting and auditing standards have changed, the componentisation of assets and the issues around when you replace them or when you enhance them, how you write out the cumulative depreciation in relation to the existing asset and whether that's readily identifiable within your asset register becomes a challenge. And the argument was that infrastructure inherently was less risky in terms of misstatement. The Financial Reporting Council are now challenging that, and the auditors across all firms are responding. It doesn't mean that the figures historically are wrong. And I just want to be clear with Councillor Cox that assumption is wrong, that they are wrong. All we're saying is that more work is required by the auditors to confirm that the carrying values are reasonable and materially accurate, and also to challenge Councillor Cox in terms of the others have got away with it. They may have a deferral for a few more months, but as the 21-22 audits begin, and they are beginning already, it will absolutely be on the radar of all firms to challenge them as to the basis of their infrastructure figures for those councils where it is material.
Councillor Cox, two things. Is there anything in what you asked a moment ago that you'd like to pinpoint out of the response you've heard? And do you have a supplementary to what you've already said?
Both.
I thought you might have.
I just wanted to, you did actually say that this area was material. And if it was material, what I still don't understand is why you don't know how it works at the moment. And to my mind, that's wrong, and that's as a failing of your firm, not necessarily the fact that you've been asked to do more work because it's been highlighted by the regulator. So I wouldn't want to see any increased fees because you need to do what you should know already. I think that's the point I would like to make, because it is already material and you should have already been on top of it from that perspective. The next point really is actually, where do we go from here? If you carry on not getting the letter from Deloitte and struggling to come to terms with the infrastructure, we need to draw a line under the sand. And I think Adam's absolutely right. He needs to move on. We all need to move on and draw a line under the sand. And if you can't get the assurances, then you qualify. And you qualify on the basis of too little, not too little, but we don't know what they are, whether they're material or whether they're not. But you can always qualify on the basis that you've not been able to get assurances. That's quite a standard qualification, and it's quite regularly used. If you can't get assurances, then you say so, and you qualify it in a set of accounts. So in the interest of moving on, I think their deadline should be raised. If we haven't got it by this date, then we need to draw a line, qualify, and move on.
So, Mr. Barber, 2 points coming back from Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chair. So I will challenge you'd expect me to do so in terms of that we don't know how it works. So rest assured that our audit procedures have always included work on infrastructure and a whole raft of audit procedures that we've undertaken in that area to understand how the figures are arrived at. This is further additional scepticism and challenge going into more minutiae and detail on the basis of those figures, because elsewhere, following regulator review, there have been questions raised at other audits about whether the auditor has dug deep enough to satisfy themselves that there is not a risk of material misstatement. So there will have been work in the past on infrastructure, but unfortunately, there will be more work required by us in this area, both in 2021 and beyond, and that will require more time, which has a commensurate fee that, as I've outlined previously, will be communicated to you and be subject to that checking process by public sector audit appointments. In terms of the second point about the pension fund, I've avoided looking into it in too much detail, but there would be potentially other audit procedures I could take. But trying to find the resource to do that and the timelines, I'm holding out that the pension fund letter of assurance will come. It's come in the past. Don't know why it hasn't come. I know there are resource challenges within other firms, including Deloitte. But the issue about the qualification or limitation of scope or emphasis of matter or whatever may be required should that not be forthcoming. Clearly, that is an option open to us, but I suspect if it's going to be an option for us, it will be an option for all other admitted bodies who are admitted to the Dorset Pension Fund who have material IAS 19 pension liabilities within their account. So they would all be in the same position. And in relation to the infrastructure assets, is it completely out of the realms of possibility that there are a whole raft of audits in the future that have limitations of scope because of the details to support the carrying value of infrastructure? Possibly. We don't know until we make those further inquiries.
Councillor Judith.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me with the mask on? Thank you. I come to this from a position of this isn't my forte, but I do have a background in finance and law, but I'm certainly not a trained accountant, so I don't come from it from a professional point of view. But Councillor Cox shot my fox, but he did ask a question. What is the reason for this delay? And I think that's owed to us as a body corporate that we're given that answer. I don't believe you answered it. I might have missed it somewhere in the ether. Now, I totally understand that normal practice between regulator and audit has got a lot of two-way traffic, and that certainly would be something which would be within your contractual obligations. So when you keep talking constantly, you're telling us about, I need more resources, I'm not sure what the timeline is. I'm disappointed that as our auditors, you haven't put in place the resources that you require. You told us about the shortfalls that you've got. We're all suffering in that regard, I must admit. but we do have a contract with you, and you have contractual obligations towards us. And I think people listening to this, if anybody's sad enough to be listening, Mr. Chair, will be disappointed that you're not able to give us the answers we're actually putting to you, and answering them in such a way that actually once I get to the end of your parable, I haven't really got any more sense than when you started as to where we are with things. The pension fund matter still haven't answered. So it's just that we would like to see, I believe, to quantify what you consider to be more work, almost in a business case. So this is what I'm required to do because of A, B, C, and D. These are the timelines. But we're not hearing that. Now, obviously, you can't say all that off the hoof. Totally understand that. But if you were to give us some more reassurance of a much firmer structure, but all I'm hearing is more and more things being teased into this golden thread. And as the man on the Clapham Omnibus, I'm finding it quite discomforting to hear that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Barber.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Chair, if I may. So it's probably, not wanting to confuse the matter further, the contract that we have is not with the council, it's with public sector audit appointments for the provision of service, and they are who we are accountable to. They are fully aware of the challenges that this presents. I challenge again the suggestion that there is a shortfall on our side in terms of resources in relation to BCP. We do have challenges as resources in terms of resources as a firm, as do others. But there has been a huge amount of resource input into the BCP audit for this year to get to where we are, given that it is a very complex set of accounts. And I've elaborated on this in the past in terms of multiple HRAs and different systems and challenges with internal controls that require further work. And in terms of the councillor's questions about why there is a delay, I will reiterate that the pension fund letter assurance is the normal default approach to getting assurance over a very large liability in the bottom half of your balance sheet. And I am completely reliant, as are you, on your local government pension scheme, Dorset pension scheme, whose auditors, Deloitte, are required in accordance with the contract with PSAA to provide that letter of assurance in a timely manner, and that's not been forthcoming. And until I have that, I am in not a position to gain assurance over that figure, and I won't be signing. Now, you're absolutely right. There must come a point where we get to a stage where if it's not going to turn up and not materialise, then we have to think about other procedures. But I just don't think we're there at the moment. It's frustrating that we're almost a year into, since the reporting date. Not that it's small comfort, but you are not alone in this position. It is a reflection of the challenging sector in which we operate that I think was mentioned at the very beginning of this item.
Do you wish to come back, Councillor Butt?
Not actually with regard to anything that was in Mr. Barber's control, but with regard to the Deloitte Touche requirement to provide this letter. They are the ones, I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman, to get more of an understanding, but they are the ones who have a reason for not signing this particular death that we're requiring, but they're not sharing with us the reason. And I think we're trying to get an understanding of what that is. It's obviously outside Mr. Barber's control. It's also outside ours. I understand that now, Mr. Barber, and thank you for that explanation. I'm grateful. Are we to know at any stage, Mr. Chairman, as to what this reasoning is so that we can better understand it, whether it's something fractal or whether it's a fundamental issue? Thank you.
Well, I think Mr. Barber indicated it was something to do with some of the admitted bodies within the Dorset County Pension Fund. I, like Adam Richards, but from a different angle, have been speaking to their 151 officer to try and speed things up to get to the nub of it, because it's going to be causing Dorset Council exactly the same problems as it's causing us. So they've got every incentive to get to that point. And I've come away from that knowing that there's plenty of goodwill with their Section 151 officer. It's just that they can't get Deloitte to do it. And that means that as a result, Grant Thornton are not being provided with the letter of assurance that they require. So we're sort of almost going around in a circle.
Thank you very much.
I do have a suggestion to make when we get to the end of this debate.
And thank you, Mr. Barber, for your answer. Appreciate it.
Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I've just been hearing all about the pension fund letter. There's a lot been said, but what I picked up on was it was the end of January when they actually said they thought it was going to happen, or you thought it was going to happen, but it didn't happen. And you've been emailing, following it up, and it still hasn't happened. If that was me, I'd probably have been on the phone. I'd have done. I really would have somehow just need to get to the bottom of the actual person that's got to do this. And if they're not doing it, why aren't they doing it? Is it going to happen? Isn't going to happen? You know, it just seems to me it's gone on and on and on, and just something's not quite right. Can you not actually put the finger on the person that is supposed to actually do this? And why haven't they done it? If they haven't done it, why not? What's the reason? And if there isn't a reason, you want it? You know, you see where I'm coming from? It seems to have just gone on and on and on, and I just don't. It's going to carry on like this, isn't it? Unless you actually nail it.
Through you, Chair, if I may. Thank you. So the partner concerned, I know that he has been off for some time from work, which clearly I'm not party to the reason. So that has clearly not helped in getting timely responses to the questions that you quite rightly suggest I should have asked, which I have done. But the fact remains that as of here tonight, I've not had a response for the last 6 weeks. I will try again and hope to hear something. But I do know that the chair of this committee, I do know that the director of finance, and I do know that myself are all lobbying to put pressure on the auditors of Dorset Pension Fund to produce. That has not resulted in any tangible outcome at the moment, and I suppose I'm struggling, if I'm honest, to see what more I can do.
Councillor Phipps.
I'd just say that if somebody's been off, or I think that's what you said, or they're not there, I mean, somebody either takes their place or you've got to go up the line. Somebody has got to be responsible, a person for this. Just somehow, just my comment, nobody seems to have actually nailed it. That's what needs to happen. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I think Councillor Cox, you wanted to come back.
I'll just say, Deloitte's a very big firm. They're one of the biggest, so they will have somebody who, if somebody's off ill or for whatever reason, then there will be a substitute. There will be somebody backing them up. I mean, I'm a sole practitioner, but I've got somebody backing me up if I fall down. And so there will be people at Deloitte who do that. So I can't accept just because somebody's off for whatever tragic reason, then they can't carry on. There are managers and there are other substitute partners that will pick it up. So I would not accept that as an excuse, to be honest.
Well, Mr. Barber, we've got your report here. We're asked to agree to note it, which I'm sure we will. But what I was going to suggest was that you'll recall that we met together with Mr. Richards and the Vice Chairman, and we met on the, I think it was the 2nd of March. And on our forward plan, obviously we've got the signing off the accounts in as an item yet again for the meeting on the 14th of April. It seems to me that I want to keep close to this on behalf of the members of the committee, and that's why we met on the 2nd of March, and I'd like to repeat that again. So we've got about a month before that meeting on the 14th of April, so somewhere in the middle of that, a couple of weeks' time, when you've had a chance to hopefully make some progress with something around this to give us more of an indication, appreciating that it does rely on third parties to some extent, would be extremely helpful. And then if necessary, I can update the members of the committee as to where we are in advance of the meeting on the 14th of April. I'm sure you're getting the message loud and clear that there is real concern amongst the members of this committee on behalf of BCP Council about the issues, and that our worry, as I expressed earlier, was very much that there's going to be a compounding effect, given that we're just about to get to the end of this current financial year. So I wonder if, with officers, such a meeting could be arranged, please, again, so that we can at least keep close to it without waiting until our next regular meeting. I'm sure you'll agree to that. And I hope that we'll be able to have better news coming out of it.
Chair,
thank you very much. Mr. Barber.
Chair, yes, more than happy to do that, and I think that's a sensible suggested way forward to see where we get to, so that we're all on the same page. And I will take away, you know, the observations that were made tonight and try again to see if I get any response, particularly in relation to the pension fund issue.
And of course, update on the position with regard to the NRC, the NAO and SIPFA over the infrastructure issue as well. Because those are the two things that are holding it all up.
Indeed.
Thank you. So, Councillor Brooke?
It's just for clarification on something on page 15, Chair. I don't know whether you want me to deal with that now or after you finished what you were saying.
Please deal with it now, because I want to move on to the next item as soon as we can.
Bottom of the first column on page 15 of the report, which refers to the failings and weaknesses in the Council's children's services. And the final sentence says, "We have now concluded our work in this area, which is reported to you in our report in the Value for Money recommendation report, but is a separate item on this committee agenda." It's certainly not on tonight's agenda. So which committee agenda is it going to appear on?
Through you, Chair, if I may. Yeah, apologies for that. That is an error in our report. It's well spotted, and that is not the case. At one stage, we were considering issuing a small report just in relation to that Children's Services Ofsted situation. On reflection, we decided it would be better to report all the VFM work as a single exercise as part of our auditor's annual report. So that is an error. So if that could be minuted, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. It will be minuted, and I thank Councillor Brooke for again his keen eye in spotting an error. Thank you, Councillor Brooke. So, members, are you prepared to note the report subject to the further meeting that I, the Vice Chairman, will have with Grant Thornton and Mr. Richins probably in the next 2 weeks in preparation for our next meeting on the 14th of April? Agree to note? Thank you very much indeed, members. Thank you. And thank you very much, Mr. Barber, for coming to present to us this evening. Members, that will take us on now to item 7 on the agenda, which is tendering for consultants. And I know that Councillor Phipps has been instrumental in bringing this item to us this evening and has been in correspondence in preparation for it. We have this evening with us the Head of Strategic Procurement for BCP Council, Jeremy Richardson. And Mr. Richardson is going to make a very short presentation, following which I'll invite questions from members. Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I will make sure it is quite short and concise for you. I'll just share the presentation. So just initially, can I just probably apologise to Councillor Phipps for the use of procurement or tendering, as I think is the presentation. So I think it's always technical. I will talk tendering, but it is procurement. So thank you for sharing the point, but just on that side. So first of all, I just really wanted to sort of outline the definition of the what we say about appointing consultants under our financial regulations. I won't go read the exact slide, but it's an individual organisation that will provide advice of a specialist nature where the council does not have those employees in place. The use of consultants will be defined preferably as a short-term period to achieve specific outcomes. So these statements are part of our financial regulations and are a process that we sort of follow through on that stage. In line with those definitions, we have clear approval levels set out across those appointments of consultants. Up to 25,000 would be a service director, over 25 to 100, service director to complete a business case approved by corporate director, and over 100,000 or more than 750 a day, corporate director completes business case approved by the chief executive. I'd just like to add that that also includes the same rules for interim staff, which also are quite different from our consultants. So we have a separate statement around interim staff. I think there's always sort of confusion that we use interim staff as consultants, or they're termed as consultants, but there is a separate set of rules around interim staff. For the procurement of consultants, the appointment comes under Public Contract Regulations PCR 15, which is the present set of rules that we operate under, and also under the Council's financial regulations. Consultants are defined as a service under the procurement processes, and the levels are set out again within our financial regulations and driven by PCR 15. So under 5 to 25, 25 to PCR threshold, and above threshold, and the threshold is 213,000 inclusive of VAT. The next point is really around the sort of procurement routes to deliver those procurements. There's three core processes we follow. If we have an appropriate corporate contract that exists, it must be used. That sits within our financial regulations. Then we would look at open competition, which would be determined by the requirement, scale, value, risk, complexity. And that basically takes in part of opening advertising opportunity against required timelines, documentation, forms of contracts, and any other relevant information that would be issued, being followed up by evaluating and awarding the contract set out in the criteria that was issued within the tender process. Third route is under frameworks. So these are public sector frameworks that sit across the wider public sector. These are set by central government and grouped local authorities that are consumed. These are used by the wider public sector, education, local authorities, government and NHS. So they're very defined. They follow standard procurement processes and give us the ability to either run mini competitions, further competitions against the selected suppliers against that, or in certain cases, there is the ability to direct award to individuals against specialist categories. Just to follow on with the procurement thresholds for consultants under standard rules, under 5,000, officers are required to obtain at least one written quote demonstrating value for money against their specification. Between 5,000 and 25,000, officers again, it sits as an officer's decision, are needed to provide the same specification to all suppliers and seek back a minimum 3 competitive written quotations. For procurements over 25,000, the procurement team select the most appropriate route to market and tender process. For a standard open process, depending on the thresholds, these must be advertised against set portals set out against legal requirements and our own financial regulations. Along with the advert, all the required paperwork and documentation laying out the requirement, scoring and other relevant information, and the appropriate time depending again on the complexity of the tender that we're looking at issuing. Bidders' returns are evaluated, scored against the criteria laid out in those documents that are issued, and an award notice is issued and recorded on the required portals again that we've issued those areas. I'd just quickly like to sort of just issue some examples on the procurement routes where we just discussed the use of corporate contracts. So an example of a corporate contract that we have at present under consultants would be with WSP. The route was an open competition. That is a contract that is around engineering consultancy. They are a main agent for that. They may bring in secondary specialist advice against that contract, but that is an example of a corporate contract that exists, and under our regulations we should be looking at the use of corporate contracts before we think outside of that process. But again, there is no exclusivity in those contracts, so if we do need to go outside of that contract, we are able to. So again, really an officer's decision against the requirement of what they're looking at trying to achieve. I think an example of the open process would be our transformation partner with KPMG at present. A very complicated sort of process we went through, fully open market. We fully engaged that process. That took over 12 months to actually follow through from tender to beginning. Again, what I would describe as a zero value contract. So any instruction that's given, there is a very detailed process around that work that is required, demonstration of value for money, and highly managed through a number of steps. So again, what I would describe as an open sort of contract. And really with frameworks, I think, they cross the board where the public sector has created frameworks. We can buy very specialist, bespoke elements of consultancy, and again, should be used where appropriate to our need, again, because it saves us on actually a procurement process and time against those. So thank you, Chair. Taking questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Richardson, and it's appreciated you being so succinct. Audit and governance is not because we want to rush through anything, it's because questions are the key for most members, and that's how we conduct our business. So thank you for that. I'll start with Councillor Phipps.
Thank you very much. That was very good. Thank you. Just a few things really. I brought this because I have noticed generally that there are a lot of what seem to be go-to companies. That's why I wanted to know how this all worked. I was also thinking that probably due to COVID, some of the tendering, I know this happened with main government, things were changed, and some tenders perhaps weren't operated in the same way. And presumably now, or at some point after COVID, I don't know when we are now back to a normal process, so perhaps you could just tell us how that worked. I was going to ask about advertising, but I see you've got it on here. But do you also have, as well as advertising, a list of certain ones that you would circulate to, or is it just a general advert and that's it? They either pick up the advert or they don't. That was a question. I was going to ask how many are chosen from. I see you get a minimum of 3, but I see in the next document that we've got coming forward, the financial regulations, there's a lot of changes been made in it. Whether that's anything to do with because we got this presentation here first, I don't know. But they do mention a strategic procurement team. Who are they? Sorry, there's a lot of questions here, but whether you're making a note of this. And how do they base their decision from the 3? I know you're looking at value for money. Sometimes the cheapest isn't always the most value for money. So there presumably are some criteria that are used. Maybe you could just give us a little bit more information on that. And just one more, the corporate contract, you mentioned WSP because that's one of the ones I'd noticed actually. They're all over the place. Are they then engaged for a certain period of time, and then that lapses and then there has to be. This is. I just wanted some explanation on it all. I hope I'm heading in the right direction and asking the right questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Phipps. Mr. Richardson. Thank you. I'll try to answer all those questions, but I may need to come back for some prompting. So if I just start sort of reverse in the last question around WSP, yes, they are against specific pieces of work. So they are a call-off contract. So they are not just a blanket supplier that sit at everything. So any project, it is a by project they're called off and quoted against. Again, services will be issuing them specifications and requirements they need and working with WSP to make sure those are delivered against those requirements set out within their instruction to WSP. I hope that answers it is complicated because actually all the charges are seen as WSP, but again, they could involve other consultants, third parties coming in to support those projects at the same time. If I jump about to the procurement routes through COVID, yes, COVID did give us the ability under the Emergency Acts, under these procurement regulations to deliver direct award. And where appropriate, we would do that, but we would still try and think about the quality and the requirement that even if we were directing award, that we could do under the rules through the emergency process, that they were appropriate. Again, that really being led by the services, and we would have been very clear with the services to come back to the team, touch on the team in a second, that actually we could record those decisions and actually they were taken through a sort of formal process through the COVID time if there was a requirement for a direct award. So again, we still had a process, so it wasn't a sort of free-for-all during the sort of COVID period, but that actually has come to an end, a little while ago. I think the government sort of correctly said that we'd come to a point where we needed to open up the markets. The sense of the market, when we talk about advertising, is encouraged against all levels, and we really want to promote, even at the lower level thresholds, that actually we are trying to open up the market. But over 25,000, we have a legal requirement to openly advertise, and it is openly advertised, so it isn't a blanket that we can just go to an approved list. So we openly advertise through our own tender portal, which is free to all participants who wish to access that, and also the government's portal, Contracts Finder, which again is a free portal, which is more of a national. Our portal sits under a partnership with the South West Councils, and suppliers can bid for anything across the South West, but those portals also exist across the other regions across the country. Where it goes above procurement thresholds, we also have to then advertise on the Find a Tender process, which is the government's sort of portal that replaces the OJU, the old version that we used to advertise across Europe. So when those thresholds pass that 180,000 of services, they are opened up as a formal procurement. My team, strategic procurement team, consists of professionals who will look at the routes of procurement over 25,000, advise services who've come to us to ask for what is the appropriate route, what is the strategy around taking that to procurement. Usually challenged because they want to do everything very quickly, so a formal process does take an amount of time. As I said, the example of our transformation partner contract with KPMG took over a year. That didn't include probably 6 months of pre-market engagement with the market of those sort of qualified partners and IT partners as well. So again, sometimes it's really the complexity and the scale of how we decide the route and what is the best routes. So on that side, hopefully that's answered most of your questions. If there's any more I need to answer.
I think so. It's just the strategic procurement team. They're employed. They're BCP employees.
Yeah, it's a team I lead. It's a mixture of officers at different grades, looking from category managers through sort of corporate place and people, and they have teams under them of procurement officers. So we are all council employees that have to act under not only our legislation but actual national legislation as well. So.
I'm all right for the moment. I might think of something else in a minute.
Councillor Judesbund.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. And Mr. Chairman, it's very basic. Mine. If we've had that presentation, I haven't had it. I was desperately trying to ping it on my phone, and I thought, don't be silly, I can ask for the presentation. Would it be possible to send that to members? Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Richardson.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share that presentation. Correct.
I did actually want to qualify, if I may, why I was asking
Certainly,
that.
sorry,
I'm very grateful.
a little technical issue.
Oh,
We're
yes.
getting feedback and we're trying to deal with it. Do you want to come back, Councillor Butt?
Yeah, to speak in the room, you can hear me anyway, the voice of strength. I'm grateful to Councillor Phipps for raising this because I think this forms part of sort of something you should know.
I think we fixed it. So would you like to carry on now?
I'll put my microphone back on. Just in case you didn't hear me, Councillor Phipps, I'm grateful for you bringing this actually because it's sort of like a stock thing to have, isn't it, to understand how this process works. And we've got a spreadsheet, or not a spreadsheet, we've got a presentation which you've put forward, which actually is quite nicely paced out, who all the parties are, what they all do, at what level. So it's almost like something which we might have stuck away somewhere for people like me who come onto this and don't quite understand. So I find it a really useful explanatory presentation, not too wordy. Obviously, you've spoken to it, but I'm grateful to Councillor Phipps for bringing it forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Butt. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's just a few things. I think you mentioned scoring within there, and I just wondered when you are scoring, how do you include how local the supplier might be in your scoring sheet? That was one question. And then the other one was when you're evaluating the corporate contracts, the ongoing contracts. I always find I'm aware of them, and I always find that personnel change, and therefore, what you think you're buying, you may not be buying in 2 years' time, and the personnel may have moved on. And do you monitor that? And do you is there a break clause where you say, I don't want to work with you guys anymore? And then I suppose following on from that, when does it change and when does it get revisited?
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you. Just to go back to the scoring is, especially over 25,000, is based across a quality price basis. So where we're doing an open competition, quality and price are the scores. So I apologise for not picking that answer up earlier, that obviously we do not go just lowest price. There is a value for money delivery, and quality is actually quite critical. One, there is a qualifier. We would think in sense of building a procurement process for a consultant that we would want to qualify, that they're actually qualified to give us that advice. There could be legal implications, etc. So there is a pre-qualifier within the process that we will set out quite rigidly, and if that's failed, regardless of them putting a bid in for the rest, that they would not be taken forward. And there is a process between balancing the quality price element. 60-40 is usually quality price, but we can higher price or quality. That sign off again is appropriate to the type of procurement we're doing, and especially around consultancy. With some of the frameworks, the prices is set out, so it is actually really a quality process and a time return from those consultants. So quality is very important, as you would imagine, with the level of consultancy you would want to sort of put forward. Regarding the corporate contracts, we do have clear breakpoints in them. They come to the end. I think with the WSP contract, that has a break clause in 2024. Though there are clauses within the contract of non-performance, but as I said, it's a call-off contract. So if we decided they have no exclusivity to that element, we can go outside of that if we feel that they cannot deliver that service we require, or at a quality or a price. We have the ability to do that. So the fact whether we did not use them for the next 12, 24 months is the form of the type of contract that sits with them. But yes, we do have clear break clauses. We usually have extension points and break clauses and penalties within the contractual terms within the contract. As I say, normally with consultants, we really do base them on zero value, so they are call off against requirements by the services who need that support and those levels. Thank you.
Councillor Cox.
Sorry, I don't think you answered the scoring one, because I was particularly interested in is local anywhere in that scoring mechanism? Because if it was a 50-50 between two, and one lived here and the other one lived in Bolton, for instance, do you give any score based, wasn't it?
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you. Sorry for not answering that point. Below 25,000 set out within our financial regulations, we're very clear that actually we want to encourage as much localism as possible, which actually was within our gift. Above 25,000, we do have to openly advertise. So that does give us issues around localism. We can put parameters around, do you have offices locally? How are you structured? Travel, that element, but we are sort of restricted in pure sort of saying that we would only accept bids from local companies above the sort of formal thresholds. What we do see and we're waiting for is further guidance on the change to the financial sort of situation around procurement regulations from government. So we're due an update from our exit from Brexit, as we still basically operate the same rules previously, we just advertise slightly differently. Principles I think government are looking at is very much this localism point, and actually does it give us more ability to appoint on a local basis at formal and higher level points at the moment. But the process is, it is open to all, it is transparent, and it is equal and fairness. Unfortunately, we can try and build a level of localism in, but we need to be careful within the process and the regulations we have to work under.
So just for my clarity, above 25,000, there is no weighting in the assessment as to the location of the business. Is that what you're telling us?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, formally, we need to be very careful how we can, to certain levels, we can be quite subtle around, where are you based? Have you got a local office? What we do around sort of social value in the sense of apprentices and stuff like that. So we can ask some quite generic questions, but we could not say we could only appoint you if you had a Bournemouth office or a Paul office or a Christchurch office. That would be outside of our gift on those levels, above 25,000. Thank you.
Nobody else, I think, has indicated. Did you want to come back, Ms. Councillor Phipps?
So I'll ask one thing. I mean, I'm just very aware that the next paper we've got is the financial regulations, and there seems to be all the changes are in red, and there are a lot of changes that actually relate to this specific subject. So what happened before this? Has everything? There's a lot of changes in there. So what's the difference? Why are we having all these changes? If you see what I mean.
I think it's a very useful question as we come into the next item, but I think Mr. Stannard has indicated, so perhaps it's better taken by him. Mr. Stannard is our internal audit.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Phipps. You're stealing one of my questions in the my answers in my bit. So Part G looks like it's changed radically because there's an awful lot of red in there. What I was going to explain, hopefully, is that what we've rejigged the order. The content is virtually identical. We have introduced some extra headings to improve the flow of financial regulations, but there's really very limited actual change of the regulations themselves. It's more of an ordering and a changing of the presentation. And that's to assist readers in the order that they would come at these issues in a typical procurement. in the old regs, they were a bit dotted around. Now we're trying to go through in a nice order of, thought process for practitioners. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. So nobody else has indicated. Could I say on behalf of the committee, thank you to Mr. Richardson for the presentation, which the suggestion, Councillor, but you are going to distribute to all members of the Audit and Governance Committee. I think that's very useful, it naturally follows on into the next report, which is helpful. So thank you very much.
Chair and councillors, thank you.
So members, there's no recommendation for us to approve on that item. Takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is financial regulations, the annual evolution for the financial year 2022-23. I'll pass over to Nigel Stannard, who's the head of BCP Council's Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just perhaps make an opening remark in relation to agenda items 8 and 9, actually? So it's just a reminder, really, that at the outset of BCP, we agreed that financial regulations and all policies that this committee approve would be subject to an annual evolution process, rather than they wither on the vine and then we have to do a big exercise every sort of 3 or 4 years to bring them all up to date. And I hope you agree that that process is bearing fruit, and it's a good process to follow. So the changes are shown in red, and they stay in red for the live version. So, as I said earlier, practitioners and users of all these policies can see exactly what's changed from year to year. So moving into financial regs specifically now, also a quick reminder that the financial regs are part 5 of the Constitution. So in accordance with your recommendation today, it will have to go on to full council for approval on the 26th of April. So technically these won't go live to the 27th of April, which is a bit of an unusual difference to how we've done it in the past, because usually they've been live from day 1 of the new financial year. But on this occasion, they won't until council's fully approved. I've explained that element about Part G, that it looks a big change, but it's more ordering and presentation. What I would like to just point out, given our last presentation, is perhaps top of page 61, local supplier line. That might be a good line for the committee just to have a quick look at. And also on pages, bear with me, I want to say 79. Yes, 79. There's some good definitions there around how we define in financial regs the difference between interim staffing and consultants, which Mr. Richardson briefly touched on in his presentation. So there's some more detailed work there. Wording there. Also tonight, rather different to previous financial years, we've got the BCP debt management policy at Appendix B. This policy was approved by Director Strategy Group because it's not a core policy for approval by a committee. But I think because it links so critically to financial regs, I think it's good practice for this committee to be able to look at that and be assured that the council has an effective debt management policy in place, and it has replaced the legacy arrangements that have existed up to this point. So happy to take any questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Members. Councillor Kelsey.
Thanks, Chairman. It may be a really silly question, but you said right at the beginning that this is not coming in until after the council in April. Is that actually going to cause any problems with it not coming in straight away like it would normally?
Stannard.
Thank you, Councillor. I don't perceive so. I think it's all around our communications. So we've got to slightly tweak our internal communications for officers, but it's a date. So I don't perceive, there's certainly no legislative requirements or anything like that. So I don't perceive there to be any problems.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Councillor Cox?
Sorry, just a comment. I think you've said before, and I'm taking this as an assurance from you, that there's no major changes here. It's just typos and wordings and stuff like that. And so therefore it wouldn't affect that at all. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Stannard?
There are some changes. For example, VAT threshold. Thresholds are now inclusive of VAT, but that's only aligning to national requirements. So what the government's effectively done is increased all the thresholds, but then put it to so in effect the thresholds haven't really changed, but they're VAT inclusive. If that makes sense. So yeah, it's just
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, but the judgment of the government doesn't make sense at all.
So, members, we've got two recommendations to this report, and I'll take them together. To approve the financial regulations as shown in Appendix A before referral to Council for adoption. That's, as Mr. Stannard said, at the April Council meeting, and to note the new BCP debt management policy as shown in Appendix B, to which Mr. Stannard drew our attention. Could I go to a vote on this, because it's a recommendation through to Council? All those in favour, please indicate.
yes.
Thank you very much indeed, members. Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Takes us to item 9 on the agenda, which is the annual evolution for the 2022-23 financial year of the anti-fraud and corruption policy, the whistleblowing policy, the declaration of interests, gifts and hospitality policy for officers, and the regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, that's RIPA as it's known, and the Investigatory Powers Act IPA policy. Quite a lot of stuff, but I'll pass over to Mr. Stannard again as the Council's Head of Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Again, just a sort of opening comment, if I may. So these policies, apart from the RIP policy, have all been in place since the inception of BCP Council. So they've passed the test of time. They've stood up to operational reality. So they're not policies that sit on the shelf and so that they're operating well from that perspective. But nonetheless, there are some tweaks here and there. And I'll just go through those now. So starting with Appendix A, which is the anti-fraud and corruption policy, this is probably the one that's changed the least. There's very, very minor editing changes there. I'll leave you to skim through those in red. I don't think, from my perspective, there's anything particularly earth-shattering to point out to you. The next one is whistleblowing policy. And the changes that we've incorporated into this evolution are really centred around trying to compare ourselves to some of the best practice principles within the ISO 37002 that's come in. Most notably, we've added a statement about the consequences of not reporting wrongdoing. And we've also introduced a 7th stage to our process, which is a formal lessons learned process with the whistleblower each and every time we have a whistleblowing. So those are the two major things in that policy. Moving on to declarations of interest, we've minor clarification changes and some additional wording to clarify one or two areas. We've got more explicit wording on the template blank forms, that officers are required to fill out if they've got a declaration. That just helps officers to determine what they need to declare and what the mitigations are if there are issues. And then finally, Appendix E to that policy, we've created a brand new frequently asked questions appendix to help with awareness with officers and to try and just promote and answer some of those questions that we get on a regular basis. Lastly, RIPA and the IPA policy. So the most significant change on this policy is the formal embedding of the second element of that, the IPA element, which refers to communications data. Now, you'll probably recall, those on the committee that have been on for more than 6 months, that we had a remote investigatory powers commission officer inspection, and in discussion with that inspection officer, he advised us that for a local authority such as ours, a separate IPA policy was probably overkill because of the remote chance the council will ever use it. So in that sense, all we need is an appendix which identifies what we would do, how we would go about running an IPA surveillance operation if it came about. So that was already in there, by the way, as Appendix E, but we've added some wording in the body of the report to point to that more explicitly. I think it's worth me giving an example of what communications data is and why the council will rarely use it. I'm going to use an example of a right to buy situation. If we, for example, had wind that the tenant wasn't living in the accommodation that they are trying to buy, we can ask communications companies, mobile phone companies, not the content of mobile phone discussions, but where mobile phones have been used. So if they are being used in, Councillor Cox used the Bolton earlier, and they're not in BCP, it's clear that that tenant is not living in the property, and therefore that's an instance we may use communications privileges of the IPA Act. I say may because we still have to pass a series of tests about materiality and whether we can obtain the data in alternative ways. So even that example is quite remote, and we probably wouldn't use IPA, frankly, but I just thought I'd use that as an example of communications data. Final thing to draw some members' attention is the second recommendation bullet point. As you know, the council now has an equalities panel, which I think Councillor Dove chairs, and all 4 of these policies, because they are evolutions, technically need to go through that group, and they are meeting next week. So I'd be obliged if there are any changes required by that panel to delegate to me to factor into these policies before they go live on the 1st of April. And I will report back to you on an exception basis if there are any material issues. I don't perceive there will be, because these have already been through the panel, or the experts that now sit on the panel last year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanhope. That's very helpful. Any questions from members? Councillor Jude Butt.
A small one. It's with regard to a service user being a beneficiary of being a beneficiary, an employee of BCP being a beneficiary of a service user. It seems fairly draconian, and I just wondered how that fitted in with all the Wills Acts that we have with regard to the absolute right for somebody to disperse their their money as they see fit, subject to any other statute. It says, it's 611 is the point. As a result of their employment, employee becomes a beneficiary of service user's will, must always be reported to the line manager and service director, which is absolutely right and proper. But the employee must not accept the request, regardless of size or value, and is granted explicit permission by their service director. Permission will only be granted where the legacy is of little financial value, such as a sentimental item. I believe that needs to be, if that's been robustly checked by legal, I'm happy, but if it hasn't, I believe it needs to be.
Mr. Sennard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Butt. That requirement is fitting with the Nolan principles in the sense that it's the perception of wrongdoing more than the actual wrongdoing. So in this example, we're not necessarily saying the individual can't accept it, but there has to be transparency in that decision. And factors such as relative discussions with relatives and so on and so forth. And until that's all resolved, then there should be no acceptance of that gift. Thank you.
Councillor Butt, do you want to come back?
Yes, I would quickly. Then therefore you know what legal documents are like. They're drafted in a way which tries to confuse, but I really think we've got the opportunity to explain that better. I think that particular paragraph has some clumsy wording in it. And if that is the case, whether we could clarify that, because I read that as I need to, as a layman or as somebody who needs to, one of the employers, I need to get permission from my service director, boom. But there's a little more that needs to go in there with regard for the Nolan principles, whether it can be, asterisked or whatever. It's just I find that it sounds to me as if legally the service director is the only person who can give permission. Permission will only be granted where the legacy is of little financial value. That's fairly finite, and that's not what sits under the Nolan principles. It's that bit in between, isn't it? As you say, have that conversation with the relative. It's all absolutely above board. It's all absolutely correct. Then that legacy can follow. So I just find that clumsy, and I don't think it's saying what it wants to be saying. I just wonder whether we could just clarify that one particular paragraph. As I say, if it's clarified and legal, who will know far more than me are happy, then I'm more than content. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Butt. Yeah, noted. I will go away and do what you say. I'll also just check that there are some flow charts, flow diagrams later on in the appendices, and I'll just check that they flow and they may give a bit more clarity than in what you're after.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Councillor Cox.
Yeah, Nigel, I just wanted to, those policies are very good, but the problem with policies, such as anti-fraud and corruption and whistleblowing, well, not necessarily whistleblowing, but gifts and whatever, interests, they're all very good, but from what I heard at another committee, maybe it was this committee, that it's kind of you self-declare on a lot of these things, and if you've got a wrong one in the organisation, then they won't. And so, do you, as part of your internal audit, do you ever monitor this? Do you do any work testing whether people are following these policies?
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Fox. No, if I was being totally honest. Obviously, it's very hard to pry into people's private lives. What we're trying to get across in these policies is that for Tier 4 officers and above, i.e. those officers who are making the most significant decisions in the organisation from an operational perspective, they have to fill in a declaration, even if it's zero. I have nothing to declare. And obviously, with the Nolan principles, the Council's Code of Conduct, on top of that, there's an expectation that people are truthful. I accept that there may be people that aren't truthful, but I can't see how an internal audit team can start Of course, we will investigate issues if we get anonymous, which we have done in the past. We've had, members of the public saying X and Y, and they're reported to this committee through the anti-fraud and corruption reporting that we do in July to this committee. So, there's been a couple in the last 2 or 3 years in that example. So yeah, I can't hand on heart say that internal audit go looking for people's undeclared issues. Pardon me?
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Cox?
Thanks for the honesty of that, and I agree that's probably the standard approach. It's just that it is one of the issues, particularly with councils, that you get thrown at you left, right, and centre, and as councillors as well as officers, and so I just wondered whether we could have a more robust approach, just so that we're seen to be taking a robust approach rather than a standard approach. Just a thought.
Mr. Stannard?
Thank you, Chair. Certainly in the awareness training and the things like our week and our news that we publish on a regular basis, the requirements for sensible declarations. I think you may recall this time last year when I brought this policy, I actually had my declaration, albeit redacted, as an example, and I still give that example out to staff to say, look, this is my declaration, have a look at it. So I'm declaring things like my children go to schools in BCP, so I don't lead and instruct the audit on that school where my children go. Now, that people might think that's I'm the head of audit and I shouldn't be influencing an audit in the school where my children go. So those are the sort of things that people need to be thinking about. So we try our best through training and awareness.
Councillor Cox?
I am just trying to make it robust. I'm not doing this as a principle. It's just that if to counteract allegations, it would just be useful that and it could be done on a helpful basis that if somebody was checking people's declarations, for instance, if they were just checking them, because you might just turn around and say, well, actually, you got that wrong, and people do get them wrong. People do actually, and actually declarations of interest change over time. And God knows I keep having to change my declarations, and there will, you forget about it until some kind lady reminds me that I've got to update them. So it's just might be worthwhile if there was somebody going along checking and saying, "Are you sure you got that right?" Then at least then somebody might be there. They may be aware that somebody's checking them.
Mr. Stannard?
Thank you. I misunderstood your earlier question. The 103 officers that exist above Tier 4, those declarations have all been looked at by me or my team. We did that on behalf of the monitoring officer. So technically they are stored with the monitoring officer in a monitoring officer's generic email account, and officers are required to keep those up to date in as real time as possible as they have things to declare. It's clearly known that the declarations are logged with the monitoring officer. There's obviously the inference there that the monitoring officer or the monitoring officer's representative is looking at them.
Mr. Richards?
Yeah, Chair, just maybe just to add a bit to the conversation in regards to this issue, in the sense that I think, as Mr. Stannard's pointed out, the Nolan principles are embedded within the Council's financial regulations. The financial regulations are embedded within the Council's constitution. It is a duty and a responsibility of all officers to adhere to that constitution. So therefore, there is an explicit personal responsibility of every single officer to ensure that they comply with those financial regulations, that constitution, and therefore those Nolan principles. And therefore, it is a condition of their employment. So therefore, if by implications they are seen as not adhering to that standard, or those standards, through that employment, then therefore they are potentially jeopardizing that employment, because it is very clearly embedded as part of their conditions and responsibilities of employment, and through that personal responsibility. I think that may or may not add to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richards. Are there any other questions? In that case, could we go to the two recommendations, which are to approve the Council's anti-fraud and corruption policy, whistleblowing policy, declarations of interests, gifts and hospitality policy for officers, and the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, RIPA, and Investigatory Powers Act, IPA policy for the 2022-23 financial year. And secondly, to delegate any changes required as part of the review of the policies by the Equalities Impact Assessment Panel on the 24th of March 2022 to the Head of Audit and Management Assurance, and subject to the relatively minor issue that was raised by Councillor Jude Butt earlier and agreed by Mr. Stannard. So could we go to a vote on that, please? All those in favour, please indicate.
That's unanimous.
Thank you very much indeed, members. Thank you. Takes us to the final item on our agenda, which is item 10, the forward plan refresh. Obviously this forward plan expires at the end of the municipal year, so there is only one other meeting. There are two other meetings indicated on it, on the 31st of March and the 14th of April. And I'll ask Mr. Stannard to introduce the report. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as you correctly said, there's two more meetings in this municipal year. The next meeting is the greyed out column, and it's the single item agenda on the constitution elements. And then we've got our final core meeting of the municipal year, where we've got some more of our either our annual reports or our traditional reports that we look at. You'll see right at the very top of that column, 14th of April, I have perhaps ticked Statement of Accounts 2021. What we've heard this morning, earlier in the meeting, maybe that's not going to happen, but we'll obviously play that one out in a couple of weeks' time with your meeting with Grant Thornton. So just bear that in mind. Obviously, we'll move that on as we need to. And then at your 14th of April meeting, you'll receive a full draft forward plan for next municipal year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. So just to come back to the point you were raising about the meeting on the 14th of April, the Statement of Accounts 2020-21, we will have that as an item on the agenda, because I think, want to make sure that we're all updated by Grant Thornton on the then current situation, perhaps in the light of the meeting that we hold online with Grant Thornton in a couple of weeks' time. But necessarily, I think members of the committee will expect to have that update. I certainly do. So we will be putting it onto the agenda. And of course, the other meeting, the 31st of March, single item agenda, is over the recommendations with regard to overview and scrutiny, and those recommendations then in turn will be recommendations to full council. So that's what we have at the moment. At the same time, looking forward to the next forward plan, there are some future items that are already up. And I'll remind members of the committee that I've previously written, as I've done a number of times before that, to seek suggestions as to what particular items, if any, you might want to see coming forward. Those that will be coming forward onto that new forward plan are a review of the council's insurance arrangements, a risk management review, and we will look to see whether there are any other items in addition to, of course, the Constitution Review Working Group ongoing work, which in turn impacts on our agenda here. And those are for items that are already flagged up. In turn, we hope to get those through to recommendations to full council sometime in the autumn, so that they can be done in a timely way before the end of the calendar year, to make sure that they are then part of the council's amended constitution within the next financial year of the council. I hope that's relatively clear, and I will be writing to members again at some stage to see whether there are other items with an explanation that should be considered for our forward plan for the future. Councillor Phipps.
Just a question, as you raised the next forward plan, so that's what I was going to do. Obviously, we had future places last time, and the minutes do state that this committee has an ambition to understand, you know, the governance that is actually being established for future places when it becomes fully operational and on an ongoing basis, and they're going to put forward together a document. And I just wondered if that was actually going to come back to this committee in the next municipal year, or is that something that will just get circulated, or will there be another meeting to have a look at what they've then put together and how they have evolved?
Well, I think what we agreed last time when we had the presentation, the long presentation, and we digested that, I think what we agreed was that we would ask for that report to come back to us from them so that we all understood what the parameters were. I was only looking at it earlier today, and I hope that's not going to take too long before it comes back. Can we take this in stages so that if we're satisfied with what comes back, that's fine. If in the longer term we think, you know, we ought to have a further review in 12 months' time, for example, after it's all been enacted, that's equally fine. But maybe there'll be a sort of middle way on that, whereby if there are any issues, we can put it on as an agenda item onto the new forward plan. But I think it would be too early to decide that tonight before we've seen the report that they're going to send us. That will be circulated as quickly as we receive it. And I think if we do it that way, then we won't be putting something onto the agenda that we might not need, but equally it will be a line in the sand if there are any issues. Does that satisfy you?
Thank you. Yeah, that's clarified it, because I just wanted to know if it was going to come forward or whether we get the report, but you've explained it very well. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments on the forward plan? Well, in that case, Mr. Stannard, can we proceed as you have suggested? And then we'll be properly prepared at our next regular meeting in April for the new forward plan for 2022-23. Is that agreed, members? Thank you very much indeed. That concludes all the business on the agenda, and I'd just like to say thank you all very much for attending this evening. Thank you for the work that the officers have done around the agenda items this evening, both those here present in the room and those online, and to members of the public who perhaps are still with us as we approach the end of the meeting. So thank you all very much indeed. A good night to you, and I close the meeting at 19.